Okay, good afternoon to you all. Thanks for being here. Thanks to the ones following in the live stream. My name is Simone Tagliapietra. I'm a senior fellow here at Bruegel. And I'm pleased to host this conversation today, which is going to focus on one of the most controversial, difficult aspects of our clean tech manufacturing debate in Europe. A question that touches upon one of the, if not the most important sector we have in this space, the automotive industry. And the question is, how should we look at the Chinese investments into the European manufacturing of electric cars and batteries? Now, we know very well that in order to meet the decarbonization objectives we have, we need to sharply accelerate the decarbonization of transport, and namely road transport. We know that electric vehicles are a key part, if not the key part of the solution. And we know that the deployment of electric vehicles across Europe, and we are monitoring that also with our European Clean Tech Tracker in a very frequent and regular, let's say, timing, is constrained by, on the one hand, still the lack of the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, on the other, certainly the cost of these vehicles. Now, when it comes to cost, we know that the Chinese models have become more and more competitive, namely vis-à-vis the European counterparts, and we see this in the numbers as basically by now a quarter of the European EVs sales are made of Chinese cars. So this is a trend that has been widely discussed across Europe in the last few years. I think that as we have seen the number of exports of EVs from China to Europe, the policymakers across Europe and here in Brussels have become more and more cautious and alarmed about the trend and which response to put in place. We know that we have in place at the moment anti-subsidies duties on Chinese EVs. We have a strategy with the Clean Industrial Deal to boost at the same time the European manufacturing. We have an automotive action plan to reinforce this strategy. So the policy action has not been lacking, but when it comes to this specific item, much more will have to be done in the coming weeks and months. Why weeks? Because we know that we have an important EU-China summit coming up in a few weeks' time. And this is, of course, one of the sectors also playing a central role in that conversation. Ahead of the summit, we at Bruegel will release a paper on this specific subject, co-authored by Cecilia Trasi, my colleague here at Bruegel, Gregor Sebastian, joining online from Berlin, senior analyst at the Rhodium Group, and myself. And today we want to use this as a first round of conversation around this issue, discussing the risks and the opportunities in these Chinese investments into EVs manufacturing in Europe, and discussing, of course, the potential policy actions and remedies to face this issue and to make the best of it. Now, in the panel with me today, Cecilia, already introduced, Gregor, already introduced, but also pleased to welcome Arthur Corben, business advisor to the cabinet of the Executive Vice President Stéphane Séjourné, and our dear colleague and friend, William Tots, Executive Director at TNE. Run show, very easy. Cecilia and Gregor will give you a first presentation of the insights that we will release ahead of the summit with our paper, and then we will enter the panel conversation and the question and answers. For all the ones following online, you are, of course, more than welcome to participate actively to our discussion using Slido with the hashtag ChineseEV. Cecilia, over to you, and then Gregor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is the presentation on? Yes? I cannot flick through the slides, though. Yeah. There we go. So, now that that's sorted. Good afternoon. My name indeed is Cecilia Trasi, and I will walk you through the first part of this presentation before handing over to Gregor Sebastian. So let me start by framing the core message of this forthcoming paper. Whenever the slides will actually work. Well, anyway, I will do without. Oh, there we go. So this is off to a great start. So
it's a typical Bruegel event. All
typical
the time
Bruegel
the slides
event.
don't move.
So let me frame the core message of this paper and the topics of today's discussion. So the first consideration is that Europe needs to urgently scale up electric vehicle production and battery manufacturing. And this is not only due to its decarbonization goals, but also to preserve its industrial competitiveness. However, European firms are struggling, both in terms of capacity and cost competitiveness. At the same time, we have that foreign firms are stepping in. In particular, Chinese companies have. And in fact, one in 4 EVs sold last year came from China. This is actually an estimate by Transport and Environment, so William Tobbs can comment on this later. And they are investing heavily in local plants and battery production all over the Union. These investments are not neutral. In fact, we have that investments are in battery plants and EV assembly are long-lived, capital-intensive, and they shape our supply chain and our software architecture for years to come. Which means that once built, then our leverage to steer the outcomes of these investments decreases over time. In fact, our key question, the quick question that we address in this paper is not whether or not these investments are good or bad, or whether we should shut the door or not, because this is the kind of discussion that is taking place far away from this room, in plants all over, again, in the different member states. The question that we have is, can we condition these investments for them to be aligned with our decarbonization goals, then the preservation of our industrial competitiveness without harming security? And one of the key barriers that we saw is that everything that is being decided in Brussels at the European level then has to overcome also national fragmentation in the different approaches. So this is the overall line. The first consideration regards emissions. So transport emissions, road transport emissions account for around 30% of all the CO2 emissions of Europe, and passenger cars are around half of this. Unlike power or heavy industry, the emissions linked to this sector have barely bulged in the last years. Therefore, if we are serious in wanting to achieve our 2030 and 2050 emission targets, then we need to decarbonize transport. And a clear solution includes clearly the mass adoption of EVs. However, we have that very few European firms are competitive in that sense. In fact, more and more European firms are leaving the mass market, as a mass market that would entail models with an average price around 30,000 euros, and instead have prioritized for several years already the premium segment, which means they have offered models for around for around 50,000 euros. So while the transition will happen, because we see that EV adoption is increasing, the question is, will it happen with European firms or not? And who else is filling this gap? China is one of the actors that is filling this gap. As mentioned, not only by exporting EVs that are cheaper, but also more and more acting as an investor. In fact, we have that in past few years. We have noticed that greenfield investments, in particular in EV and the battery sector, have been increasing over time. Only last year, that amounted to around 5 billion euros, which represented around half of the overall greenfield investments in Europe that year. If you look at plant level data, we see that these investments are spanning the whole value chain, from upstream to cathode and anode productions, midstream, battery and cell assembly and production, and finally to downstream all the way to EV assembly and recycling. And they reach, as said, several countries. So they come to mind flagship projects like the CTL plant in Hungary, or the one in Germany, the Envision plant in France, or the announced BYD plant in Hungary. And this phenomenon made so that now China is the second largest investor, right behind intra-European flows and ahead of other Asian investors, notably Korean investors or the US. Is this good or bad? Well, foreign investments are never, good or inherently bad. In fact, they provide a lot of benefits. The first one that we saw clearly is that they help filling the battery manufacturing, let's say, gap, the gap between the existing capacity and the target capacity. We have that the existing capacity is around 200 gigawatt hours, and mostly, by the way, related to plants that are foreign owned. So, for example, the LD facility in Poland, or the Samsung SDI facility in Hungary, or in other facilities in Hungary as well. However, its target, as set in the Net Zero Industry Act for 2030, is to achieve 550 gigawatt hours. So clearly there is a gap, and foreign investment can help fill this. Then we have that foreign investments, Chinese or not, they can support regional reindustrialization and offer opportunities for local job creation. In fact, beyond what is generally estimated, like next to the announcement of a plant, like for example, the ATL plant in Hungary that is supposed to create around 9,000 jobs in Debrecen, we have that when we look at the specific plants, the common idea that a Chinese plant will only be let's say, worked by Chinese employees, this is not necessarily true. We see that, for example, in the ATL plant in Germany, that the hiring of non-Chinese workers have been increasing over time. Whether that is an isolated case or not, it's up to debate, and whether this is a high value roles or not, that's also it's up to the discretion of the single plants. And finally, and probably most importantly, is that Chinese firms currently excel in the cost optimization and the in terms of technological innovation. In fact, Chinese firms very often not only offer cheaper alternatives, but also alternatives that are just at the technology frontier and innovation frontier. And Chinese firms, so Chinese investments, if well managed, can help with the transfer of operational know-how that can help them to fill this innovation gap. This, again, of course, depends on whether these are well managed or not. There are also some risks that cannot be overlooked. There are specifically, this is true always for foreign direct investment, but specifically in this case, because of the nature of these firms and the nature of the very product. First is that Europe is already quite reliant on Chinese-controlled inputs, and this is true for every single, let's say, every single one of the, almost every single step of the value chain for batteries and EVs. And this, therefore, exposes Europe to, it weakens its position in the face of a clear and industry leader, and gives the industry leader the opportunity to weaponize this leverage, as exactly has been the case with the recent export controls on rare earths and magnets that do harm the European industry. Then there is the risk of market distortions. So the automotive industry in China, in Europe, in US, everywhere, clearly has always benefited from substantial public support. However, Chinese firms are not isolated in this. However, what distinguishes Chinese firms is the amount of public support. In fact, there have been estimates by actually colleagues at Rhodium that just show how much out of proportion this is. And this basically risks entrenching unfair advantages in the market. Then, specific to the nature of this product is the fact that EVs are software-defined products, and therefore charging networks as well are software-defined, which means that embedded hardware, proprietary software, and cross-border data flows can pose surveillance and sabotage risk in the case of geopolitical conflict. And other consideration that also has been at the in the mind of European policymakers is the risk of European workers and firms to remain stuck in the low value added segments of the production. So the risk basically is that host regions risk being stuck with assembly job, while core R&D, IP, and in general the critical steps of the value chain remain instead, let's say, protected in the origin country, in this case in China. This is not theory. This is exactly what has happened with the visited countries and their experience with European and East Asian investments in the automotive sectors in the past few years. So none of this is lost on European policymakers. We have here Arthur Corban that can either confirm or deny. And as said by my colleague Simone, in fact, Europe has several tools in place that have been using in the past few months. So of course he has mentioned the countervailing duties, but also there is the foreign subsidy regulation, the expansion of the NIS2 directive that covers cybersecurity threats, and particularly since March we have an action plan specific for the European automotive industry that aims at boosting its industrial competitiveness as part of the Clean Industrial Deal. And in that document, the FDIs are mentioned as a potential, again, opportunity or threat as well. For the very first time, their role is acknowledged. So this is just to say that Europe clearly has instruments, but is still lacking its strategy. Much of this has to do with the fact that foreign investments are screened at the national level and not the European level, which means that then the single screening regimes differ and they respond to the different incentives that these countries have. So we have a situation in which we have some countries, like, for example, Hungary, that is friendlier and maybe even more willing to close an eye on due diligence. And then we have some other countries that are completely banning everything Chinese related, like Lithuania, for example, or some more other countries that are more cautious, like Sweden. While there is merit in allowing member states to pick and choose, there is a problem when it comes to, again, thinking of a strategy that can support our overall automotive industry, because national fragmentation then undermines all efforts at the European level. And especially the timing for this is interesting, considering the fact that, as mentioned by Simone, at the end of July there will be this EU-China summit, during which Beijing for sure will push for the uplift of the tariffs on EVs, and will definitely make use of its leverage on export controls on rare earths and magnets. So it's necessary to have, again, a strategy in mind before going there. Having said that, I will hand over to my co-author, Gregor Sebastian, for an overview of the tools and the policy recommendations.
Thank you, Cecilia. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear.
Yes, fantastic. Okay, thank you, Cecilia, Simon, and also Bruegel for the event and the fantastic collaboration on the report. Just very briefly, because Cecilia already pointed out the kind of intense debate in Brussels, the statements in the auto action plan on conditioning. We've kind of, as part of the report, before we jump to the policy recommendations, had a look at, what are the current tools out there, both in terms of which ones have already been used, which might be used in the near future, and which ones are kind of in the developing toolkit, but may not be deployed for a couple of years to come. And as Cecilia pointed out, I think one of the challenges for the EU is that it doesn't have the direct power to regulate FDI, right? That lever lies with the member states. And even in the revised, FDI framework that's currently being discussed in the trilogue, it's highly unlikely that we're going to get to a situation where we have a net economic benefit test like Australia or Canada that would, basically set a minimum threshold also applying to greenfield investments across the EU, right? This is, for the moment, I think, highly unlikely. So this means that Brussels has to rely on more indirect tools to influence investment behavior, to kind of harness some of the opportunities that Cecilia laid out, also minimize some of the risks. And a lot of those indirect tools then also mean, there's a caveat here, right? And we kind of try to go through that in the report, outlining, there could be unintended side consequences. For instance, when you use trade defense instruments, that they could also impact other players in the industry that you might not want to target in order to incentivize greater EU value add or minimize some of the kind of risk related to supply chain overdependence on a specific actor, in this case, China. Or there might be a high political cost attached to these, right? For instance, we have a section in the report that also looks at conditioning market access through joint ventures and licensing, and actually some of the recent EU policy initiatives, I think it's a Clean Industrial Deal or the Competitiveness Compass, they also outline, there are potential exemptions in the WTO under GATT Article 20 to actually look at some of those models. But, these remain, at least when it comes to FDI in this sector, untested, and there would be a high degree of political will that would need to be justified. So what we do in the report, and we can go to the next slide, is really trying to take a very pragmatic approach and say, the Commission has a lot of latent power. The challenge is actually using it, but also using it in a coordinated, careful way, right? Because if you throw all these potential tools at the issue or perceived issue, you might end up with no investment because investors are uncertain about the future. They might also be uncertain about whether they're welcome at all, right? So that is one aspect. The other aspect is, I think most of us are relatively tired of looking at, what could happen in the next 5 years. So we kind of tried to look at the existing tools and suggest a few tweaks or use cases that could also be implemented over the next few months, if not quarters, also with keeping the EU-China summit next month in sight. So maybe we jump to the next slide. I think we're still in the toolbox and go to the policy recommendations, which we group in 4 buckets. The first one would be looking at demand-side measures, really saying that the biggest lever that the EU has, and Cecilia also pointed that out already, is the size of the European market. Especially now that we've seen in the US, not only that there's a huge degree of demand destruction for EVs, where obviously Chinese players are really strong, but also because there are other regulations embedded in the IRA. But I would actually highlight the ICTS measures related to connected vehicles as the kind of biggest hammer here that the US is taking to basically oust any Chinese player, even if they're locally invested from their market. So this gives the EU, in our view, a lot of power. The question is now how to harness that, right? Without also falling into the trap of, saying the next logical step is obviously to implement local content requirements. Instead, we would say, and this is something that the Commission also highlights in the Auto Action Plan, is to prioritize the use of non-price criteria. For instance, when it comes to corporate fleets, which could then be used to say, well, we don't only want to have a higher uptake of zero-emission vehicles, but we also want to encourage sustainable and resilient investment to kind of mitigate some of the risks that Cecilia highlighted. Second, and I think some of the co-panelists will have a lot to say about these points as well, is looking at public financing, right? This is kind of the second biggest lever that we see is state aid. And we see that individual member states, especially last year, were actually taking a quite proactive approach, trying to shape Chinese investment, right? By saying, we are happy to provide you with some help with your investment, right? Streamlining that, also giving you some subsidies, but in exchange, you need to do X, Y, and Z. The problem is, if you don't have an EU-wide approach, this really encourages a race to the bottom, where other member states who are maybe just happy to get the final assembly don't impose similar restrictions, right? And then obviously from the perspective of an investor that wants to keep its options open, might also want to import cheaper inputs from China, the logical step obviously would be to go to that second player. So here we would also suggest it's really critical, and we obviously have impending, I think it's coming out to this week, new regulations on state aid, that we actually do attach conditions, right? And that we have some sort of EU level coordination here to avoid this race to the bottom. Thirdly, is looking at the cyber and data risks, which are genuine. And we've seen this as well in other sectors where there is data transfer from Chinese companies, but also obviously other companies from the EU back to their home country. And one of the aspects that we highlight here is that these risk assessments need to be dynamic, right? Obviously, it's great to have a first risk assessment, which is currently ongoing in the connected vehicle realm. But given the technological change, the first thing that needs to happen is to have these regularly, right? Because it doesn't matter what the risk assessment says now if the technology is at a completely different stage in 2 or 3 years. The second aspect, and this links back to the initial point that Simon and Cecilia made, is if we want to harness Chinese investment, we should try and avoid kind of blunt measures that say, you can't have your technology at all here. So we should rather look at what are proportional safeguard measures to mitigate some of those risks. that could also include some seemingly drastic steps like looking at, on the NIS2, what could we do under EU operational control? For instance, with TikTok right now, they're actually looking at handing over some of their data handling capacity for the European market to a third-party provider, a European firm, right? Some of that may become necessary in order to kind of maintain market access for some of these Chinese players in Europe. And then the final aspect would be looking at the foreign subsidy regulation, which probably shapes up to be one of the most influential tools when it comes to incentivizing, but also right-sizing some of the Chinese investment, which, as some of the studies that Cecilia cited, has benefited from subsidies and could also threaten to distort the single market. Here we say the first aspect would be to actually look at those risks, address them with the tool, but also keep in mind that overly strict and stringent mitigation measures, and the tool does really give some quite stringent measures in the hand of regulators, could also chill broader FDI flows. So we would suggest to look at greater transparency measures around the enforcement, but also what sort of data is being looked at, and then consider, instead of saying, we cap your production or we force you to share your R&D, to force the company to reinvest some of the subsidies into an EU fund that could then be redispersed to fund more EV and zero emission technology research within the EU. And with that, I'm going to leave it here and pass it back to Simon.
Thank you, Gregor, and thank you, Cecilia, for the overview of the upcoming study. I will move directly to the panel, and maybe Arthur, if I may start with you. I mean, you have heard about the ideas outlined by the colleagues here, and the question maybe here would be really what, so does the Commission have the political appetite to make market access generally conditional, or is the priority the one of avoiding a trade escalation with China, also considering the broader trade tensions we are in? So how do you see the current situation, what has been done so far, and how do you see things moving forward?
Many thanks, Simone. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be there. I think that's one of the most interesting topics to be discussed currently. That's the one topic where all citizens feel it in their gut, so it makes it even more interesting for us to deal with that. Taking a step back and diving in afterwards. What does this title, this issue about EV, China, Europe, tells us? I think it tells us one thing, is that now we are really entering into an area, a time where we are at crossroads on three main elements: the industrial agenda, the trade agenda, and the decarbonization agenda. The industrial agenda, more and more, it has been used in order to protect or to help support companies. The trade agenda worldwide has been used in order to make sure that we deal with industrial topics as well. And then the decarbonization agenda is there on its own because we have to deal with it, and the Europeans more than anyone else, because we don't have fossil fuels and we don't produce them. So decarbonization is key in order to regain competitiveness moving forward. The EV issue, the automotive, is really at the center of this trilemma. And that's why at the European Commission, when we started in December, we'd said that we would present emergency plans, and we started with the automotive action plan. We started with the automotive action plan after having built actually the compass, which was inspiring ourselves from the Draghi recommendations, which is exactly what I said at the beginning, to be honest. It's how you reconcile the three agenda and you provide an agenda of prosperity for Europe. This was the compass, then it was the clean industrial deal, and directly in the clean industrial deal, you have a connection between decarbonization, industrial, and also FDI conditionality. There are specific paragraphs on this. There is very clear wording on what the Commission needs to take into account and what the Commission needs to do moving forward. So this to say that both in the clean industrial deal and the automotive action plan, there is a clear understanding that we need to deal with this issue within the Commission. Why that? And I think here it's due to a dual situation that has become a political necessity to be dealt with. First, you've seen it very clearly. There are increasing Chinese investments and increasing Chinese products exported from China to Europe. This is an industrial strategy built by China. They are creating, and it's not only an automotive issue. Like we are meeting companies that say every single day they come to us and say, yes, we have the same issue as the automotive, the steel, and the chemicals industry. There are overcapacities being built because there is subsidies given massively. It creates a massive issue in China. They have 25 million vehicles built every year, and they need to export in order to make sure that there is actually a future for them. Then there is also a second factor, which is the price war in China. It's extremely difficult to do business in China currently because there are more than 100 OEMs actually fighting for survivals. And then, yes, the prices are going down, and it's make it super difficult for our OEMs, our car makers, to survive. And also there are also policies that are aimed at actually incentivizing domestic players in China. This is the first element, and I just don't want to mention only OEMs because we tend to mention car makers most of the time, but the situation is extremely difficult for the suppliers as well. Don't want to enter into trade deficit arguments or etc. But the suppliers are going through very difficult situation as well with China. For the past decade, like we went to a surplus of 7.7 billion to a deficit of 1.4. That's huge in terms of change and in terms of presence highlighting. So this is what is happening currently. This is extremely difficult to manage. I don't know. Do you still hear me well? Okay, it seems to be changing a bit, and then it makes companies changing their mind, industries changing their mind. You have what you would have never expected maybe 6 months, 10 months ago. You have companies from across the union coming to you and say, okay, now we need to get additional protection. We need to get subsidies only for Europeans. You need to get local content requirements to support us. And this, including big companies that have business in China, but they see the market, value chain by value chain, closing, and then they are seriously at risk. One of the most interesting meetings that I had, it was the European Chamber of Commerce in China. They explain, like years after years, value chain above value chain, how it becomes difficult to do business in China because market is closing, and they use the value chain to make this happen. We need to make sure, and that's very important, that we have a balanced approach in terms of how we do business together, because it will not, and also going further on the impact that it could have in Europe. It's like it's not only where vehicles are produced, but for example, if German car makers stop to export, it's Central and Eastern Europe that will be directly affected. It's like this will be the first and foremost impact, and so we have to make sure that we have a right strategy to deal with that. 3 elements where I think we are working currently and where we can actually build some leverage, and this strategy this is an event on EVs coming from China, but it's how we treat all foreign partners. We never have a Chinese approach when we do a industrial strategy. The first one is like the reciprocity and balance. As it was said, next month there is a meeting. It was called by the President von der Leyen herself, and the purpose of this summit is to recreate balance in a situation where there is structural unbalanced. That's the purpose of the meeting. That's why she convened this meeting. And I think during this meeting and during this period to prepare the meeting, it's very important for us Europeans to remember that we have a tendency to think that we are weaker than we actually are. If I look at structurally how the auto market is built currently, OEMs in China need Europe to grow. There is nowhere else now with what is happening in the US, they won't grow there. That's Europe, or many will fail to grow. And if you fail to grow in China, what does it mean? It means you cannot innovate anymore. And if you don't innovate anymore, you just disappear. That's the logic there. And so they need European markets to grow, both OEMs and battery. And we tend to forget this. But this is the biggest leverage. It's the beauty of the single market. It's the beauty of a very dynamic and prosperous European single market. And that's the most important point moving forward, is that we have very good leverage. First. Second is that we have also implemented tools. We did not do nothing. We have tariffs set currently. They have their intended effects, and that's a reality recognized. And the tariffs were there not in order to proactive tariffs. It was to address a situation of structural imbalances, and that's also a reality. And I think the Commission analysis, which was done very carefully, showed that there were structural imbalances to be dealt with. So, thinking about the willingness, it's next month. We have this summit. Lots will be discussed there. Regarding the tools, we have to make to work on what we've included in the plans, being the automotive and the clean industrial deal. There are very clear delivery. There are very clear delivery in terms of how we will do FDI screening, and at the same time how we are going to actually link the public subsidy to several conditions. This is written black and white in the automotive action plan and in the clean industrial deal. Then, and I will all of this, it's a delicate I think balance between openness and protection. I think being open is really in the European DNA. We can't be closed. This is really something we have to take into account, and I think that a majority support that. But then that's this delicate balance that we need to find. Openness, at which conditions, protection, using public and private procurements when needed. And that's also I'm not inventing anything. This is something in the plan as well. And lastly, to conclude, what are we talking about? It's not only China exporting to the EU. We are speaking about fundamentally how we are reshaping a global value chain, or how the current trade tensions is reshaping the European automotive value chain. And we need to make sure that within this month and year, we don't end up having the EU as an assembly line, because it would be extremely impactful, both in terms of economics, but also in terms of jobs. This means that, and I think there is a growing understanding across all actors, across all the value chain, that there is a need to act. And there is also an underlying element, is that you will move from very global exporting to more local for local. And in that, that's very clear, and I think my EVP has been repeating it a lot. It's like, we want people to choose Europe. That's it for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Arthur, for this overview, and I am sure that we will go back to several of your points during the debate. But before that, let me turn to you, William. You have been also doing a lot of work on this at TNE. So what's your view on all of this? And maybe, if I may also ask you something on the state aid front, since tomorrow is the day, that will be appreciated.
Okay, well, thank you so much for organizing the debate. I had a chance to look at a draft version of your report, and I have to say I was very impressed. I think it's a very well developed paper and an excellent proposal. Let me say 2-3 things as introduction. One, Chinese clean tech is a marvel. It is one of the only reasons why the world still has a good chance of decarbonizing by 2050. That's a fact. At the same time, we are being asked as Europeans to now spend 5% of our GDP on the military. I think we all understand why that is the case. And so in the case of large conflict, how dependent do you want to be on China? That is a question that maybe I as an environmentalist cannot answer, but I think the answer to that is logical. The third element is, and that's a very practical element, if you allow one nation, be it Korea or China or France, to completely monopolize a supply chain from mine to battery, this will not only create dependencies for your economy at large, but it will also create huge problems for your car makers. Because if that happens, the chance that your car makers, when they compete with car makers from that country, that they will get the same prices is small. And one of the things that the EV investigation found that led to the imposition of tariffs is that European Western car makers operating in China do not pay the same prices for components as Chinese car makers. Now, if you do not have diversity, if you do not have resilience, it will be very hard for our car makers to continue competing in China and in the emerging markets. And if they cannot compete there, they are no longer global players. So this is, there's a very practical reason why you need to act on this. Then I have observed the Commission develop the Automotive Action Plan. I was part of the meetings that Ursula von der Leyen called with all the car guys. I would say that your Automotive Action Plan is an excellent plan. I would also observe that there's an issue with follow through in Europe. We announce a number of things, and I think Gregor described this beautiful list of things in the toolbox. If you would use each of those to their potential, not all at the same time, you would get the desired result. The question is, are we doing that? And we will find out tomorrow whether the new CSAF state aid guidelines will effectively support clean tech manufacturing in Europe, in particular batteries. I'm expecting to be hugely disappointed. What we had been proposing is, let us look at what works in the rest of the world. Let's look at what the United States did under Biden, where they introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, and they combined output-based support for clean tech manufacturing with resilience criteria. And what it led to was the biggest boom in clean tech manufacturing in the United States in history, and a form of collaboration between Chinese and American companies that your report describes as desirable. We said Europe should adopt this model. I cannot disclose all the things that were said in private meetings, but basically the response to that was, I'm sorry, that may be a good idea, but that is not part of the doctrine. So we're not going to do that. Maybe that changes by tomorrow, but I'm not so hopeful. And I think this is really, that's maybe where I will end, but this is the biggest issue. If we say that we want an industrial strategy in line with what Mr. Corbin has described, then we need to take action. And state aid is the one instrument, perhaps together with trade, where the Commission has real power. All the other stuff is much more complicated because it requires approval by Parliament and Council. So, yeah, follow through.
Thank you, William, and I think that indeed tomorrow we will get some answers to these questions.
Maybe we get some answers now.
Which are, of course, very complicated. Do you want to react on this point? I saw you handling the mic, so I thought you would.
But I expected Will to try. No, I can't disclose. Like, there is college tomorrow morning. Everyone knows that's a very sensitive file, and I think everyone knows what was the position from our cabinet. So
fair enough. Okay, let's move into the Q&A. I have a list of questions from the online audience already, but maybe let me also turn to the room in case there is, I see one. No? Yeah, please. Sure. It should be, yeah.
This one? Okay, thank you. You just had to do that. It's like the level of support that has been analyzed, China compared to OECD. It's 4 points. And actually 4 points for an OEMs, it's what make you are at 5 and you go to 9 and you are very profitable, or you are at 5, you are at 3 and you go to 7. This changes everything. Or you are 2 and you go to 7, to 6. This changes pretty much all the economics of the businesses, and that's very interesting that you have now gotten that extract and analyzed, because you can't compete under that conditions. That's pretty clear, actually.
Thanks. So, questions from the room? Anyone that? Yeah, please. There is the gentleman here in the front.
Thank you much. Yes. Tim Rentrop, DG Employment from the European Commission, but of course speaking in a personal capacity with the benefit of a Chinese wife. I've actually put in Slido the question regarding the Chinese Communist Party, because I fear the discussion is making the same mistake as President Trump, who thinks investments, in particular now with China, are governed by the balance sheet alone. We can be as attractive as we want. If the Chinese Communist Party is afraid that opening a factory in Europe by a car maker or a battery manufacturer will lead to mass layoffs in China, the company CEO will probably disappear like Jack Ma, reappear after a few months and say, oh, sorry, it's called off. Shouldn't we need to watch out that if we try and pull investment here and generate jobs, that we will do something about the staff of those companies in China, maybe take them over as well so that we don't have this kind of obstruction? Or conversely, should we offer the management of these companies a safe haven, that if the police knocks and wants to put them in the fridge, they can jump on the next plane and stay here and get a red carpet treatment?
Thank you. Difficult question. I guess we will come back to that in a minute. I see a lady back there.
Thank you very much. You can get it. So my name is Peti Bazilska with the European Initiative for Energy Security. I have a very concrete question, because we're also working on FDI screening. Do you have any idea of what exactly should be the conditionalities to allow foreign investments? Because we also have been looking into that. We agree that we have to have the same conditions across the board, possibly also alignment with other legislative files like state aid, innovation fund, and you have also the foreign subsidy regulation, like a twin regulation with the FDI. But what have you, your report, does it look into what exactly conditions we need to put in the FDI screening regulation?
Thank you. Gregor, do you want to probably take these two questions?
I can answer the first one. I couldn't acoustically hear the second one, so you might have to paraphrase that for me, because it was not loud enough.
It was about the precise conditionalities to be applied. Which kind of conditionality to apply to the investments?
Okay. Starting with the first one, I mean, completely agreed that is a risk. What I would say though is China is already conditioning outbound investment, right? So as we are now looking to condition inbound investment into Europe, China, through its capital controls, is already basically telling its companies where it can and can't invest, right? So if you look, for instance, there have been public cases quite recently directly in the sector, BYD in Mexico, for instance, where MOFCOM and or SAFE were basically telling the company, you can't invest, right? So I think this is probably the most likely outcome that could happen if China perceives some of these efforts as too damaging to its own economy. And basically, it's then a choice, right? Do they allow their companies, most of which in the EV sector are private, to scale up, which still probably allows them to benefit somewhat at home, right, by sending profits back to headquarters. The bulk of R&D will still be done in China, right? This is the case for European companies as well, who also still do most of their R&D at home. They may be still able to export a couple of the parts, right? Nobody is looking at having a localized playbook of 100% local content rules. But this is, I guess, something where the Chinese leadership just needs to take a decision. And again, here's the question of leverage. And I think the EU, through its huge market size and also by the fact that other countries are doing the same, does have a lot of leverage. On the second aspect, I think we're orienting ourselves based on the language that's also in the action plan, right? We're not looking at local content requirements per se. We're more looking at sustainability and also resilience criteria, right? So one aspect you could look at, which is already being used in other sectors, is avoidance of over-reliance on one specific source country, right? And you could start by having a relatively low percentage of 40%, right? You can't have, 60%. You can't have more than 60% of your inputs coming from a specific project in order to be eligible for project X, right? If you, for instance, look at corporate car fleets, that could be one aspect. And it really differs by instrument, right? If you look at state aid, you would probably look at other conditionalities. You would maybe look at what is the local R&D footprint? What is the investment in local staff upskilling, right? So it kind of depends. Are you more looking on the demand side or more looking on the supply side?
William, you wanted to jump in on this?
Yeah, I think the simplest thing would be to work through state aid. Today we have a situation where almost all large Chinese investments in the automotive and battery supply chain enjoy significant levels of state aid. I'll give you one example. The CATL factory in Hungary is being enabled by a huge amount of state aid, like literally billions direct, and then also all the infrastructure around it. This is completely unconditional. You could change this and you could say, we do not give state aid in a number of sectors unless it is tied to a form of joint ownership, a joint venture, which could be 50-50 or 51-49, tech transfer, training, number of EU people in key positions. All of these criteria could be linked to this. This would be by far the simplest way to approach this, and it would create a huge incentive. And I think the key word here it's been mentioned a few times, is leverage. If you are a European automaker seeking a joint venture with a large Chinese battery maker right now, what leverage do you have? It is, you have the access to the market, but as the CEO of Stellantis, Tavares, said, the Chinese are coming, they're coming anyways, with or without me. So that doesn't really give you a lot of leverage if you're doing a joint venture. This, 10 or 20 euros per kilowatt hour, which if you sell your batteries for 80, 70, 80, is huge. This gives you a lot of leverage. And if CATL says, I don't want to deal with that, there will be one of the other companies that certainly will want to deal with that.
And if I may, it's not only about state aid, but also about all the kind of EU funds we provide to support these projects, right? So conditioning also all the upcoming EU funds available, including maybe the competitiveness fund itself, will be very important with this.
100%.
Completely. And we can look at what worked in other markets. There are some good examples overseas in the US of the same players that did joint ventures with other players, US players, and it worked well. And so if we provide additional leverage, yes, we will strengthen our OEMs actually in that negotiations. And the conditions, I was taking back the documents that we are looking at, as indicated in the Clean Industrial Deal. It's ownership of the equipment, EU-sourced inputs, EU-based staff recruitment, the need for joint ventures on intellectual property transfers, to start with. Very clear.
Thank you. Please, I see one question on the right and then one down on the left. On the left. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Hello, Miguel Olmedo from Shearwater Global. I just wanted to ask, the Commission mentioned that the tariffs on EVs is one of the tools you are implementing to deal with the structural balance between the two blocks. Then why is it that Minister Wen Tao and Šefčovič have announced already that they are very close to closing the deal on a minimum price system, and why is that instead of extending it, for instance, to plug-in or hybrid models? Thank you.
Okay, first question, and then there was another one on that side.
Hello, Vesela Dimitrova, Logos Public Affairs, working with the batteries value chain in Europe. I think there is a convergence of opinion on the need for output-based support measures as expressed by Mr. Tots from TNE. But of course, we also understand that it's not possible to comment on tomorrow's state aid framework. So from that perspective, maybe the question relates to the announced battery booster in the automotive action plan and what measures are currently being explored to address this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And maybe, William, you want to come into this battery question?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is on the EV tariffs. Do you want to take? I'll just say that this was of all, if you look at the entire toolbox, this was actually the only area where the Commission has taken decisive action, and it did not lead to the end of the world, as some people said it would. It actually led to Chinese car makers and Western car makers announcing that they would manufacture more in Europe, which is exactly what you would expect from those tariffs. If we would now walk back from that, I don't think that would be a very good signal. But of course, that is not my decision. On the convergence of support on production aid or output-based support, perhaps outside DG competition there is a convergence, but within DG competition I think there's still work to be done. If you look at the battery booster, financing needs to be a key part of it. Then in addition to that, there's other things you can do. There is the FDI screening. There is also the battery carbon footprint, which has been discussed for a very, very long time. And yesterday people were telling me there's a new draft circulating. I don't know about that, so maybe the Commission knows about that. Keep trying.
You came with good questions. I'm not going to comment the first negotiation. Those are negotiations. The tariffs are still in place, and they are still having an impact, and the desired impact based on the European Commission analysis. So that's what we would need to look at is are there any circumvention measures that are being used or that are being planned, and this is an additional element. So that's for the first one, and that's always the same in a negotiation. Everything is on the table until the day where you negotiate and you actually have a deal. So we will see. But as I said, the tariffs are in place and they are not supposed to go. First. Second, on the battery booster, super important element. Why we have a dedicated section on batteries, because we've came to the conclusion that it would be strategically a mistake not to have European players in 2030 in the battery segment. It will be a 100 billion per year market in 2030, more in 2035, even based on the lower estimates. We cannot, from an economic perspective, let this go. Like, it would be really letting the clean value added and the clean investments go to third countries and third countries in general. So from an economic perspective, it makes sense to go into the battery segment. Then from a pure, if you look at different sectors, yes, we need it in the automotive sector, but if you look at the stabilization of the grid, more and more we will have renewables, more and more you will need battery storage. That's, again, looking at what works in the market, California using 70% of solar every day, storage, and at night they deliver 30% of their energy with battery. That's how it is working. And I think there are several countries across Europe that will look like the Californian energy mix very shortly, and so that's a strategic element. Then, moving forward, looking at the defense sector. Defense sector, more and more defense operation will be led by drones from a very, very vast majority in a couple of years, let's say 10, 15 years. You can't have a third country operating your drones. That's the view that we have. And so that's another reason to make sure that we are actually producing the battery technology in itself. And then on the OPEX in itself, based on the automotive action plan and nothing further, we said that we will look into it. Why? Because OPEX, unlike every other kind of aid, is, and if it's output based, it's an aid for success. You only grant an aid for something that is actually working, and not for something that may go in a couple of time to go. Then what we are looking at within the battery booster, and that's also as part of the plan, it's how we can use, with all the requirements that we have within the innovation fund, the 1.8 billion that are still allocated in order to support the ramp up of the battery value chain. This is a difficult discussion. We are not being able to do as much as we can because, and that's also the beauty of the law, you can't do whatever. You have to respect some stuff, but we are truly looking into that in order to make sure that we can deliver production support for manufacturing in Europe in the segment of batteries. We are looking at this very fast. Then I hope that we will have good news on the carbon footprint for batteries soon. That's the second point. The third point, it's like the Commission is actually doing a lot of CTIP negotiations that which are not FTAs per se, but which are in those. They are most of the time related to clean tech, and we need to make sure that we create export markets as well, because it's kind of create offtake agreements for our battery makers within Europe. That's also a very important element. Then you will potentially have also NZEA rules starting to enter into force in 2026. This could cover batteries, we will see, and that's something we need to take into account. Then, not as part of the battery booster itself, but in order to drive demand, you have the corporate fleets. That's super important. We've been said it. Whenever it's public financing is linked to that, we would need to do European cars and see how we can include public, let's say, non-resilience and sustainability criteria attached to that. That's a very important one. And we will have IDA, the Industrial Decarbonization Accelerator Act, at the end of the year, where it will not focus only on the automotive part, but broadly on those. And there we will set also some conditions in order to make sure that when there is public money involved, EU in particular, it comes with a set of criteria attached to that.
Thank you, and thank you for mentioning the corporate fleet. By the way, it's also one of the questions we have from online. And William, I know you have been doing quite a lot of work on corporate fleet. Key issue when it comes to the greening of transport, but can we use corporate fleets also in a way to boost resilience? So is there a way to also work on the demand side of the story? Because we discussed previously state aid, EU funds for the manufacturing, for the plants. But when it comes to the demand side, what can we do to also foster our resilience there?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, if you want a coherent, comprehensive industrial policy, you need to work both on supply and demand. That's also what we've seen in China, where actually, the whole EV revolution started with Chinese bus fleets going electric, and that was creating the first demand for the first supply and the first production. One of the unique things about Europe is that we have a huge corporate fleet. So 60% of new cars are sold to corporations. That's incredible. Most of those vehicles are sold under tax regimes that are specifically advantageous. They're like benefiting kind schemes. Belgium is notorious for that. So you can shift that part of the market towards electrification very quickly. If you do that whilst including resilience criteria, then indeed you create a huge market for European or made in Europe or whatever you want to call it, produced vehicles. we are expecting a proposal by the end of this year. And again, I think the question is going to be followed through. We are in a, the corporate fleets has been under discussion for many years. I remember walking into the office of the previous climate EVP saying this is something you should do. So that's a long time ago. There was an attempt to do it as part of Repower EU, and now we are finally going to see a proposal. But of course, the politics has changed a bit. I think the question is, of course, not everybody will love it. There are some car makers who are selling a lot of cars into the corporate fleet channel. A lot of those cars are ICE vehicles. They are concerned that they might lose some market share. On the other hand, if you want to have an industrial policy, you sometimes have to make choices. Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
No, completely.
Comments?
Yeah, because at one point, like we are going through the 5th year of decline volumes. That's what all the car makers are saying. So then, public financing, it's also an issue. Like it's across Europe. We've seen what happened over the past year. But if we want to actually boost back volumes short term, this is the best solution. So we have to do it, and we have to deliver on this. And boosting the volume and attaching criteria will help actually not only to support car makers again, but the whole value chain. And the situation of the whole value chain is actually very, very complex currently, and they badly needed this because it's much more volume than everything for them. So we need to do that. Then it's not only because we've discussed a lot about cars, but we also have the trucks segment, and we need to look at it in a very particular, to pay attention to the criteria that we would choose. But trucks, for example, could also benefit from this when we know that the situation for the trucks industry, if you look at the CO2 standard, it's extremely worrying, and we really need to see a boost of the deployment on the market. We are at 1.3 and we need to be at 33 in 4 years. So speed is needed now, and we need to make sure that we have the conditions attached to that.
Thank you. I see one question here in the second row, and another one from Peter on the back.
Thank you, Alessandra Cassisi, Global Council. I have a question related to the more concrete part of this. Where do you see the nexus between the EU needs and the Chinese investment? Is this something that we're going to see relegated to foreign investment for national interest projects? Is there going to be a niche of projects and programs and investment really circumscripted? I don't know. Or do you see other channels where we can actually make investment from China and EU needs and gaps meet? Thank you.
Thank you. And then Peter on the back.
Hi, Peter Chase, German Marshall Fund. Usually when people talk about industrial policy, what they're really talking about is labor policy, employing people, not just manufacturing cars, but employing people to manufacture cars. You have two things at work here. One is a shift from the ICE industry, which has high employment, to electric employment, electric vehicles, which are less complicated and employ less people. You also have modern factories that are becoming more automated. How do you make an industrial policy as labor policy if the employment levels generically might be going down? What is the political aspect of that?
Very pertinent question indeed. Gregor, do you want to go first? And then maybe Cecilia, if you also want to step in.
Same point as earlier, Simon. Can you rephrase the first question because I didn't catch that? The second one from Peter I got.
Can you start with that? The first one was on the...
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, that's a really good question, right? I think we do see that already, right? That in the EV sector, and actually not just in the EV sector, in most clean tech sectors, a lot of the new jobs that we should be looking for also come from the services sector, right? I think you can see that actually in solar more so than EVs, but also in EVs, right? There's going to be a whole new industry related to charging, right? There's going to be R&D that at the moment is heavily focused in China, right? Because that's where battery technology has been developed. and also where a lot of the employment in Germany is coming from, right? When you look at the kind of ICE employment in Europe, a lot of the still existing employment in Germany is also heavily skewed towards the services industry. So I think to a degree, you're right, Peter, that there will probably be some adjustments here. It probably at a very macro level, this is also something where you need to look at the demographics in Europe, right? There will be a change in the manufacturing system. If we want to be competitive, it needs to be a highly automated industry. This is also how China is thinking about this, right? We have kind of the very labor-intensive parts of the vehicle, looking at wiring harnesses, right? They're already shifting away from the center, from Western Europe. They've been shifting away to the periphery. And I think that trend will continue. So there will need to be different kind of attractive points in this transition for different member states, right? Probably Western European countries like Germany, France, they still want to have some level of EV manufacturing, but it needs to be that highly automated kind, and it needs to be the R&D behind it. That said, we're also looking at manufacturing jobs kind of creating all these spillovers, right? And I think this is where both the US, but also the European Union is really interested in, right? It's not necessarily counting each individual job in a manufacturing plant, but then thinking about what's kind of behind that, right? We're thinking about the steel industry that's impacted here, right? When you think about batteries, you potentially have a greater employment base also in the chemicals industry, right? Than you might have in the ICE sector. So there will definitely be transformations, and I would not bet on, us being able to replace all the ICE jobs, but I think there can definitely be new value generation, and there can be spillovers, right? From the chemicals industry, you can then potentially develop new products. I think Arthur was mentioning the drone industry, right? So you have all these kind of potential linkages to other industries, energy storage, right? That are impacted by changes in the EV industry as well.
Thank you, Gregor. I think Cecilia will take the first question, and then we'll wrap up our conversation for today.
Indeed, I don't think this works, but let me know whether I can do without. I can also do without. Oh, okay. Then no. Actually, just on that, just a stat on this, just because Gregor mentioned the solar industry as well. It is true that some jobs will just shift away from manufacturing, but this is again not necessarily a bad thing. So if we look, for example, at the solar industry, we see that in Europe, 9 jobs out of 10 are actually in the installation and maintenance of solar panels rather than manufacturing, which again, this is not to say that it's not going to have significant labor implication, the shift from the ICE to electric vehicles, but it's also, it's not all doom and gloom. That's what we say, and then I'm not going to repeat what Gregor said very eloquently as well. To be completely honest, I'm not sure I understood fully the question, but as far as I understood, what is the nexus between the EU needs and the Chinese investments? Well, the tools and the tools that we can channel these investments are exactly as we list in we list also in our report, and it was presented as well by Gregor. Something that I would like to just remind a little bit that this is also there is a window of opportunity. So our European industry, the European automotive industry, is clearly struggling. And because we need to decarbonize fast and we need to be competitive. At the same time, however, Chinese OEMs are clearly struggling because of our capacity and super sharp competition at home. And there is another key market that is completely shut off, and that is the US, which means that the attractiveness of the single market is both as a destination for exports and a destination for investments is increased, if anything. So if we could use this, again, the single market as the main, our main, say, offer in a coherent and consistent way, then we can easily marry our needs with their own. Yes, and there is one clean.
Arthur?
Yeah, just one reflection on the jobs. A lot is at stake. That's true. But years after years, we realize that the EV as itself, and we did not discuss economic security standards per se, but that's also something that we are looking into, not only for the EVs, but also for the future, which means connected and autonomous vehicles. And there is a growing reflection that we will need to get into the components as well. and to make sure that we produce components when there is electric braking. Who can be satisfied with the fact that we don't master this? Really, that's, you can say to anyone, like, yes, we need to be able to provide this solution. And I think looking at this from an economic security perspective provides you also with additional space during this transition. Then it's a transition. We tend to forget that we don't ask tomorrow to get full EVs everywhere on the road, but it's a transition, and we need to reflect during the transition what are all the tools that we need to use. One last pen, it's on a personal point, but if there are 57 regions of country in the world that are promoting local content, there may be a reason.
William.
On the labor point, there are some trends that you cannot stop or influence. EVs require have less components, automation is going to happen, and if you have a number of companies in our heartland that require 2-3 times more employees per car produced than their competitors, that is something that will have to be addressed. And I think this is, nobody likes to talk about that, but I think it is important that the EU also develops a strategy for that, because it is going to happen and people will be affected, so you need to be ready for that. On the nexus EU-China, and that's maybe my concluding remark, there is a huge space for good collaboration. You know, China has technology that we want, that we need, that our car makers need. What we are proposing is a form of collaboration that is very, very well known to China, because it is precisely what China asked from foreign investors in the past when they came to China. Collaborate with us, form joint ventures, teach us how to do it, and then there will be a huge market for you and you can make a lot of money, and we will all benefit.
Let's see whether this is something to be replicated around here. Thank you so much all for the attention and participation today. The report will be available in early July ahead of the summit, and very happy to hear your feedback afterwards. Thank you so much again for today. All the best.
Thank you.